Good morning. I'm here to moderate the session on performance measures. It's something you've heard about, something you've been reading about, and actually we have a form now that gives evidence of the fact that we will be collecting, or you'll be collecting, data on performance measurement. I hope maybe next year we can have a session on what do you do with that data to manage your program. That would be on performance management. So with that said, I'd like to turn this over to our speakers, and we're ready to go. Thank you.
Good morning. We have packets in the back, so if you don't have them, Jane is willing to pass them out. Just raise your hand if you don't have one yet. And you don't want to miss out on this packet. It's really fabulous. I had a bag of Smarties for Jerry, but I forgot them, so I'll have to bring them later. Today we're going to spend about 4 hours with you again, which we always get so excited about, and I know that you're excited about because performance measures by far are the most exciting thing on the agenda for the next few days. So we are going to break up the session. And so it won't just be me speaking today. We have Nicholas Cavallo from Apprise, who many of you know or have talked with. He's the one that calls when he needs to better understand your reports, and he's the one all of you call when you need help understanding your reports. So this is Nicholas, if you haven't seen him, but talk to him. Here he is in the flesh. We also have folks from the Performance Measures Work Group speaking today. So Jane Blank from Wisconsin will be talking later in the presentation, as will Jenny Sullivan back there from Northrop Grumman, right, out of Montana. She works for the state of Montana. And then we also have Heather Jones, who everyone knows from the state of Missouri. We'll also be talking a little bit toward the end of our presentation. So we've broken it up into parts, and we're going to go through first kind of the objectives for each section of our presentation. We expect that after the first part of the training, you will all have a better idea about what data are required for each measure. You'll kind of understand the procedures that you and the steps you need to take in order to begin data collection. And then we also want to give you an idea, kind of like we did last year, about how to take that data and get it onto the report that's due. And so we'll be talking about that. When we go to the second part of the training, we're going to take all of those steps and we're going to put them in a checklist format by theme. And so we're going to talk about when you look at different areas of your LIHEAP administration, you look at all the different teams you might have or areas that you focus on a day-to-day basis. How does this checklist for performance measures kind of get incorporated into your day-to-day activities? What is it that you should be focusing on? And when should you be focusing, right? There are some things that really need to be done sooner than later. And so we're going to talk about that. How does the data collection reporting timeline kind of correspond with the work that you should be doing on the ground to get ready? And then we're going to, at the end of that section, talk about training and technical assistance that's available. So by this time, if you're new or if you haven't heard this before, you're probably freaking out. And so this will be our attempt to talk to you about all of the resources that are available. The third part of the training, we're going to talk about performance measures and performance management, because they're two different things. And we're going to talk about how all of this framework for performance measurement fits into performance management. How do you use this data to tell a story? And so we're going to talk about how different pieces of the puzzle that you're currently reporting, your household report, your grantee survey, how all of that works into a performance measurement system, and then how the new performance measures build upon that. During this time, we'll have Jenny and Jane come up, and they're going to demonstrate ways that they're using performance measure data and currently existing data to actually implement performance management. How are they using it to tell them something about their program and then taking that information and changing their programs? And then we'll also talk, Heather will talk to us about the self-assessment tool that's under development. It's a really cool tool that kind of brings all LIHEAP resources together, and she's going to talk about how it can all help you as you take this performance measurement journey. That's the last corny thing I'll say. Maybe. So this is a little bit, we're going to kind of go over this in a little more detail. From 8 to 9:30, we'll talk about data collection and reporting for both restoration prevention and energy burden data. I think it's important to point out here that this is where I'm a little nervous, right? We all have it's nerve-wracking enough to just stand up here and speak, but it's also nerve-wracking to plan a presentation like this when I can see in the room that there are lots of new people. I can see in the room that there are lots of people who have heard this a million times. And then there are a lot of you in the middle, right, who have heard this once, but maybe stand to hear it again. And so a very wise person told me last week that there are really kind of four groups of people we're talking to. The brand new people will eat this up, right? And you'll be at the same place where everyone was last year, where you're kind of looking at us and saying, what and how? And your eyes will glaze over at some point in the middle of the presentation. And that's okay, right? The point of this is to hear as much as possible, get exposed, hear the language and the definitions and the ideas. And then the more we talk about it, the more you will hear. And that's really the second group of people, right? A bunch of you at last year's training by hour 3 were indeed glazed over. And we even said, I was looking through my notes, and we even talked about the fact that the more often you hear this, the more it will make sense. So for some of you, hearing this again will either trigger, oh, I get it, it'll click, or some of you may hear other new things, right, that you hadn't heard before. And then there's the overachievers in the room who just have it all right already. And so for those in the room, this presentation will give you an opportunity to repeatedly pat your back and give yourself kudos for all of the great work that you've already done. The second part, we're going to talk about collecting and reporting, so it will be, once again, a little bit more technical, the steps that you need to be taking, and that includes steps for implementation and then how those steps fit into kind of theme areas of your program. And then the last piece, as I mentioned, we'll be going kind of over the logic model, not in great detail, but enough for folks to understand how different pieces of your LIHEAP reporting fit up into the performance measurement and then the performance management system. And we will, once again, be really kind of discerning between the difference between the two of those things all day, because there is a difference between performance measurement and performance management. And hopefully by the end of the day, you'll be able to recite that difference. Once again, this kind of goes into a little more detail about what we just talked about, but we're going to be showing you some very, very concrete examples of what it is, inputs, outputs, outcomes, and how you use that using the existing data in the data warehouse. And so this is a tool that is available to all of you. So when you leave here, we're not just going to show it to you, right? You'll have access to it, and you can go test it yourself. And so that's a pretty awesome thing. So all of you have this packet, and some of you were here last year, you know that some of the things that we're going to go over are going to be tiny on the screen. They're tiny on the paper, let alone the screen. And so when we go over some of the more technical forms and templates, you will want to follow along in the packet, and we'll make sure to tell you what you need to pull out. But what we have in here are the performance measures, reporting form and instructions. Many of you have seen this. If you haven't, this is a great place. This would be a great place to sit and read tonight, right, your bedtime reading, because I think what it'll do is help you kind of sum up what you heard today and how that will be used. We have FAQs that we started, and I think it's really important to talk about how this document is a work in progress. So I can guarantee that after today we'll add questions to the FAQ, and then we would anticipate that as you all use the website, as you call us for assistance, we'll continually add questions as we come up with answers and more guidance. We have the performance measures data collection guide. This is the blue and green sheet. And this is a lot of what we're talking about today, in that it kind of spells out for folks the different ways that you need to integrate and implement performance measurement into your program. We have the logic model, data exchange templates. Both of those are things that we're going to go over. And then we have the website. Do we have screenshots? Is that? No. So we're going to actually show you the website, which is way better than the screenshots. So we're going to have Jane and Jenny are going to show, and Nick are going to show you kind of the interface and how it works and what's in there. So we'll have, I fought for 3 breaks. Someone else fought for 1, and we compromised with 2 breaks today. So we will have them in between the sections. If we get done, just like in the regional trainings, if we get done sooner, great. We will tell you when to be back after each break, and we really hope that you'll actually come back. Hi, Susan, I just saw you back there. I think that's it. I do think we should hold questions until we have lots of chances for questions and answers. So if you have a question that's burning, there is a very small slide number in the orange thing, in the orange block up there. We can reference the slide. We can reference the slide and we'll come back to it. We can take super burning questions. I can tell usually because Jerry McKim's like hopping out of a seat or someone is hopping out of their seat because they really have a question they don't want to wait on. So we're not going to punish you for that. But we would appreciate it if you held questions until our breaks.
There will also be a chance for questions tomorrow morning. On the schedule, you'll see a one-on-one with OCS and Apprise staff. And we're available for kind of more in-depth conversations about concerns that you have with performance management during that time as well.
All right. So as we mentioned, this first part, we're going to talk about data collection, data reporting. We're going to start with the restoration and prevention measures, and we're going to talk about the data you need, the steps for collecting the data, and the steps for reporting the data. Once again, these are things that you've all heard, but hopefully hearing them another time or in a different way will help things click or help you raise harder questions for us as you've already started implementing this. Remember that the first set of performance measures have to do with the restoration of home energy and the prevention of loss of home energy. So basically what we're measuring here is households who came into you and who had already been disconnected or are already out of fuel. How many of you use LIHEAP to rectify that situation and get them reconnected or get them fuel? We're also talking about prevention of loss, so people who are at imminent risk of losing their home energy. Either they're nearly out of fuel, which we'll talk about, they have a utility disconnection notice or past due notice, or they have equipment repair or equipment that is perhaps on its way out. So in those cases, we're talking about how do we make sure that the person doesn't slip over that edge and that we're trying to prevent rather than restore. We know restoration costs more money. We know that any amount of time a family is disconnected is not good at all. And so being able to increase the amount of prevention over time in relation to restoration is really the end game here. The data that you would need for restoration and prevention measures are, first of all, the home energy status of the household when they apply. And so this is talking about, were they disconnected? Were they out of fuel? Did they have equipment that didn't work? It was inoperable? Did they have disconnect notice? Were they already disconnected? You know, all of those kind of, where are you at? And many of you ask this question. We found this to be true, that a lot of you are asking this question in order to administer crisis services, but many of you aren't tracking this information. The other thing is many of you track who's already disconnected, but not who's at risk of being disconnected. And so when we've talked with grantees over the last year, this is a distinction, first of all, that they're collecting the data somewhere in the system that they can go back and report on, but second, that they're collecting that, that difference, right? Not just people who are already disconnected, but people who are at imminent risk. And then the other piece of information, as I said, imminent risk, the other piece of information is where was the LIHEAP benefit applied? And Nicholas will talk about this, that there are really two sections of the report. One looks at where the benefit was applied. The other section of the report, as we'll talk about, looks at the primary fuel source. And so we're talking about two different pieces of data collection, and Nick will get into that in some detail. So the status of home energy service at the time of application. This is the first piece. We need to understand if the household is without energy service. So these options might include disconnected, out of fuel, or has inoperable equipment. Inoperable includes red tagged equipment or equipment that if powered on will result in injury or death. So it may be operable in that you can turn the power on, but if it is going to explode or emit carbon monoxide or hurt someone, then it should be considered inoperable. The other thing is that we know when a furnace is broken or something isn't working, people turn to alternative sources of heat, right? In Oregon, we pipe on our wood stove. In some places, people use a baseboard heater or even a space heater. And so even if households heat or cool their home in some other way, they should still be counted as having inoperable equipment if they can't use their main system. So if I'm using firewood because my furnace is broken and someone comes in and fixes my furnace, I am technically, you're restoring my home energy. So that's a really important distinction. Just because they have heat through an alternative source doesn't mean that they shouldn't be counted in this measure. The household is at imminent risk of losing home energy. So this is a little bit trickier. And as we said before, this isn't something that states were already collecting in a lot of cases. And so some of you are going to have to give some thought to what this means. What does imminent risk mean? And so in the utility portion, that's a little bit easier. We're saying that's a past due or a shut-off notice. For some of you, that might be many of your clients. On the fuel side, it's a little bit trickier. We're saying it's nearly out of fuel. And we'll talk in a second about examples of what that might look like, because some of you are going to want to put something more specific than nearly out of fuel on your application. Some of you, that's completely fine. You'll let them, that's a good enough description for you, and that's fine too. But we'll give some examples here in a few minutes of different ways that you can define nearly out of fuel. And then has equipment that is still operable, but places them at a risk of losing their home energy service. So two things about this. Imminent risk should be defined by you. I'll tell you what isn't imminent risk, and we might hit this on another slide as well, but there are a lot of folks who do preventative maintenance on furnaces, for example, in some of the northeastern states. The criteria is simply that they got LIHEAP or weatherization the year before, or they got a new furnace the year before, and so folks go out and they'll have someone change the filter, make sure it's functioning. That person, just because they got equipment repair, or you may be using equipment repair money to pay for that, it doesn't mean that the folks were at imminent risk of losing their home energy. So this isn't necessarily a quick check. There needs to be some criteria, and that criteria should really align with whatever definitions you're using in your state for crisis. Many of you have crisis definitions. And when I say align, it doesn't have to completely overlap. That's up to you. But there should be some, they shouldn't be contradictory. Whatever you're saying for imminent risk on performance measurement, you should also be able to see that somewhere in your crisis definitions. The other thing that I've forgotten what I was going to say. So that will have to be good enough for that slide. The other piece here is energy source. So tracking where the benefit is applied. Now, we'll talk here in a few minutes again about needing to track primary fuel type, but in this case, your system or somewhere in your system, you should be tracking what fuel type the benefit is applied to. And so it might not be the household's primary fuel source. In fact, many times, as you know, we give LIHEAP to folks who are at risk of losing energy, but it may not be what they're using for their primary fuel. And so, for example, if the household is at imminent risk of running out of propane for heating, the energy source is propane. If the household has had their electric disconnected and cannot run their propane furnace, and you're paying their electric to get the propane running again, it's electric. It's wherever you're putting the money. So this particular measure follows the money. And then finally, if the household's propane furnace is repaired or replaced, then the energy source would be propane. So once again, just follow the money and you're good. Give me the money. All right, so steps you need to take for collecting. We talked a little bit about this just now as we were going through, but determining your state's criteria for imminent risk. There are many states that haven't done this. And we heard last year when we talked about this that it really kind of forced some states to go back and re-look at their crisis criteria. And so this is a good opportunity to do that. When you go in, figure out what does imminent risk mean? In other words, when would a LIHEAP payment be preventive? And so this can be in your policy manuals, in your state plan. As I mentioned, some states when we talk about imminent risk, it's easier to define for utilities, right? Past due, shut off notice. When we talk about fuel, it gets way trickier. And so some folks say nearly out of fuel, and this is a self-declared. If you haven't figured out, this goes on your application, right? So what's the challenge with putting nearly out of fuel? Everyone's going to check nearly out of fuel. So having it better defined can sometimes be helpful in that regard. And so we've put some examples here, and these may have even been updated, but in Maine, they say less than a 3-day supply of fuel, and even give more than that, 1/8 of a tank, a reading of 25% or less. And so this applies to other delivered fuel types as well. In Michigan, a residential fuel tank must not contain more than 25% of its heating fuel capacity. So there are advantages and disadvantages to being so specific. The first is you will kind of narrow down and hone in on who really is an imminent risk. But the other piece of the challenge, and perhaps you all can chime in, but if you begin to get very specific, you have clients that say, I don't know. How do I know if my tank's at what or what? You know what I mean? So there are some challenges on each side. And so I'd advise talking to your peers, finding out what they're doing, and we're happy to provide more examples of what your peers are doing as well. Adding home energy status to client application, this gets back at what we mentioned. A lot of you are asking during intake whether a client has at-risk factors. Are you already disconnected? Do you have a disconnect notice? Are you out of fuel? But putting it on an application helps in terms of tracking that information. And we have listed here just, some of the pieces you would need to have. Disconnected, out of fuel, inoperable equipment, past due, shut off notice, nearly out of fuel, or unsafe equipment. And we've included here an example of the Minnesota client application, which basically asks all of these questions in a way that gets the client thinking about it. And that way the intake worker isn't having to ask everything and track it. It's already on the application. And we have more. Wyoming, I don't think they're here. So the Wyoming client application is a little bit more detailed. And in this case, Wyoming actually gets information from the propane companies. We're not necessarily advising that. I think for some of you to set that up from scratch is a lot of work. If you have that in place already, that's great. But we're saying you don't have to do that to get this information. You can ask the client to self-report. And then we have Missouri's client application, at least last year's. This might have been updated. But it's another way of, this actually gets at what their primary fuel type is as well, which is another piece of information we'll talk about later, but you need to be collecting that. It talks about whether you're currently out or in threat. And so this is a good source of information. There's some work around the equipment repair and replacement. So we visited lots of states where the equipment repair and replacement work is all done by weatherization folks, your contractors. We visited states where this is done by the LIHEAP Energy Assistance team, and there are states where it's both, right? The energy assistance folks can do equipment repair and replacement as a crisis service, or weatherization can do it as part of their whole home work. And so regardless, there needs to be criteria set for restoration and prevention when it comes to equipment repair and replacement. So, for example, we visited a state where we met with the weatherization folks, and they said, well, does this mean that all health and safety repairs we do should be counted here? Well, that's something for you and your state to talk about. What is it that would cause the auditor, the contractor, whoever it's going to be on the weatherization side to check a box that said this equipment repair and replacement prevented home energy loss? What is it? What's the criteria for a contractor or an auditor to check a box that says this restored home energy? And those criteria need to be set by you and your weatherization contractor. And if multiple people are doing equipment repair and replacement, it's something that will need to be decided and communicated to everyone who's doing it. So that the people on the energy, so in Oregon, I'm going to pick on David and Lisa. In Oregon, the energy assistance folks can do equipment repair and replacement as part of the crisis services on the energy assistance side, but weatherization contractors do it as well, making sure that they're both using the same criteria for what constitutes a restoration or prevention is really important. And I think so, establishing criteria and then coordinating reporting. Are they reporting it the same way? Is it as simple as putting it on an invoice or work order or on an audit? Helping weatherization contractors to figure that out. They may say, we'll figure that out. We'll report it to you at the end of the year. You just tell us how you need us to report it. But it is helpful to talk with them about ideas because some of them make it way more complicated than it needs to be. And sometimes really all it needs to be is a checkbox on the audit. And then a data person can go into the system, whatever system the weatherization people are using, and collect all of those that were flagged as restoration or prevention. So this is that coordination is really important. And then the energy source for which the benefit was paid. Now, I remember last year making a comment that if you don't track this information, there's some bigger questions you need to be addressing. But it's come to my attention that there are people where that's not immediately clear. Either it's buried or they work with subgrantees and get a minimal amount of information from subgrantees, and so they may not be able to immediately tell what energy source the payment went to. And so this is something that's important. If you are restoring or preventing home energy, you need to know where the benefit was applied. Electric, gas, fuel, oil, propane, or other. So this is really important, and this is both for energy assistance and for equipment repair and replacement, including cooling equipment repair and replacement. I will make a quick note. Arizona's not here, but I'm going to put them on the spot anyway. So in some southwestern and southern states, water is used for evaporative cooling. Some of you will give a water payment. At this time, OCS isn't collecting that information. However, if any of you really want to make a case for beginning to collect water payments, and that would be water that's necessary to restore or prevent loss of home energy because of evaporative cooling, let me know, because we're willing to work with those states to kind of test that out. And then if we feel that there's enough of a case to begin collecting and reporting that information, we'll consider doing that in the future. Oh, sorry, no question. No, I'm just kidding. All right, so questions? That's up to, okay, so cooling is a great example of where it's important that states set the criteria, right? In some states, cooling wouldn't be necessarily considered a prevention of home energy loss because it's not hot. It's it just isn't, right? In states, in the southern states, any of you who know that cooling can sometimes be as important as heating, you know that prevention of home energy loss may be replacement of an air conditioner, and that's something you need to decide, but it can be included in there.
Okay, so we also may purchase heaters or heating equipment, so those purchases would be.
Yeah, as long as you, so the trick with, some people will make bulk purchases of things, I think I'm tracking now. So some people will make bulk purchases. You wouldn't count the bulk purchase. You would count when that equipment goes into a home. But new, I mean, anytime you're talking about new, I think that the preventing home energy loss with equipment repair and replacement is always a tricky one for me. And I gave the example last year of places in Alaska and in Oregon and now up in actually Upper New York. I heard some tribes talk about the fact that you have places like the EPA and what's it called in our state? I'm looking at you, David. What's it called? The people that make us put our cars and test our car emissions. Whoever it is, that awful place. They've put these rules into place about wood stoves and how DEQ, not DQ, because they're awesome. DEQ is requiring folks to take out their wood stoves because they put off too much pollution. And they're basically saying, I mean, they're making it a law. Now, any of you who have seniors or have worked with seniors know that they will abide by the law as it's spoken, right? And so what we are seeing is if folks haven't already had their wood stoves replaced, they just won't burn them. And for many folks in southern part of Oregon and in other places in this country, wood burning stoves are their primary source of heat. So this is one kind of off-the-path example of where replacing a wood stove or even putting money toward replacement if you're leveraging other funds would be counted as preventing home energy loss, right? Folks will not be using their primary heating source if they're not burning the wood stove because some DEQ told them not to, or EPA. So there's a good example of a place, and I'd encourage you to kind of think through those scenarios with your contractors and your subgrantees, and if you have clients meetings or advocacy, those are other places to of course, Texas back there. If you have unique situations, really begin to give some thought, and a prize is, as we'll talk about, is always available to kind of vet that with you. Does that count? Should it count? How do you count that? So. I'm really glad that you said that. So we've had people ask us in the past, if we're talking about prevention and restoration, are we only capturing crisis benefits? And that is not the case. It's for all. In many cases, many of you will use regular benefits or standard benefits to address a home energy crisis. And so really this counts for any bill payment assistance. Yes, which is why in Oregon and in other states where energy or equipment repair and replacement can be done by both energy assistance contractors and weatherization contractors, there not only needs to be the criteria set, but it needs to be coordinated. So you need to be able to pull the same data out of both of their systems if they're different. Yes. And in many cases, of course, the question was weatherization folks use a lot of different funding to do their work. And so when we talk about equipment repair and replacement, are we talking about anything outside of LIHEAP weatherization? And the answer is that if there's any LIHEAP weatherization dollars that went into that repair or replacement, it should be counted. Kind of like the DOE $1 rule. So you may only use $50 of LIHEAP and $1,300, this is unlikely, I know this as I'm saying it, of DOE or other weatherization funds, you'd still count it. But it does have to have some LIHEAP weatherization in it, $1 at least.
This may not be a question at this point in time, but thinking about this and the weatherization part, we do furnace repairs and replacements in Maine under the weatherization of the LIHEAP. And so I'm just interested to know, and this might not be the right time to ask, what people may be using for data collection software databases that's going to do that. I have a database
Does anybody want to take that on? Texas is like. The question was Maine, right? Maine has a system for reporting on, correct me if I'm wrong, just holler, equipment repair and replacement when it's done through the energy assistance side. But,
That's not true.
okay, see, she's going to need to talk loud because I.
So, what I'm saying is that for the weatherization side, but very specific, weatherization database, but when we do furnace repairs and replacements under the weatherization component, I just have, Excel spreadsheets to keep track of what we're doing in the homes. And so I was interested to know if there's another state that is administering both fuel systems and weatherization, and what they may be using for database tools that are going to make it easy to collect the performance measures.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so this is something that we've had conversations about with a number of grantees because there are a lot of people dealing with these issues, right? They have data systems for one side of their program but not another, or vice versa. Weatherization has a great tracking tool but not for their LIHEAP benefits. So there are a couple of ways you can handle this. One is, as you mentioned, a centralized database, and that's kind of the gold standard, right? But not everyone has the money, the time to do that. So one potential solution for you to think about is, what information can I get via just Excel spreadsheets? This information can be collated in a number of ways, and I think if you think about it in kind of the least burden, the least effort, the least time on your part, then that gets at the essence of what we're trying to do. We're not trying to impose a lot of extra work on the weatherization contractors. All we want to know is specific occurrences of when equipment and repair happened in homes so that we can better understand the effect of LIHEAP dollars in kind of all their instances across programs. So that's kind of a longer answer than what systems are currently in place. But we know that there's a lot of data systems out there, and we try and stay away from getting behind one another because we know the cost behind those, and we know every state has a different amount of resources available to handle those issues. And that's something that is definitely an internal conversation to have, and also a conversation to have with a PRIZE staff or your OCS liaison about what best next steps can you take to really resolve those kinds of issues between programs. And what we have seen, I'll pull out Oklahoma as an example, is if you provide the weatherization agency with a simple data collection form for them to report to you on, that oftentimes gets you what you need, assuages their concerns about cost, and really gets you the information that you need for the form, which is what we're going to talk about in the next couple slides.
And they always love another form.
They always do, of course, yes. I think that's a great point, but of course, these data are required, and therefore we want to get the data in the most minimal way possible. And that's why we talk about Excel spreadsheets, because at the end of the day, it's cheap and easy, and it's fast.
I just want to add that. So we've gone to four states we visited, and at each one, we've found grateful people at the weatherization end who, and actually at the energy assistance end too, who really thought, gosh, constituting any kind of new data collection is going to be a huge additional burden, and really walked through folks and found out that they need to collect less than they thought. Right? Or they were better off than they thought. And so I do think it's important to, if you have questions, not strike out on your own. Definitely ask us and we'll help you figure it out. In all of the states we visited, the weatherization offices, the response has been, oh, this is it? We collect this, we just haven't been being asked to report it. And so for them, it's just a matter of changing what they're reporting. Once again, though, those measures about the restoration, prevention, and equipment repair are new. So those are ones that you'll want to get on in terms of discussing. But the rest of the things are usually things they collect in their own systems. They just haven't been asked to report it in a systematic way, and we can help you make that request.
Alrighty, and there's going to be lots of opportunities for questions throughout the presentation, so please don't hold back. So one of the things that I kind of get confused by is there's a lot of information that we provide in these slides, right? And the one thing that always helps is to tie it back to a visualization. So for me, what I like to do is go back to the actual performance data form that we're being required to report with, right? So these are in your packets. They're going to be on the left side in the very front. And we're going to start from the second page, which is the performance measures section of the performance data form. So as Melissa kind of alluded to earlier, I like to think of it as kind of two very different sections of the performance measures section of the performance data form. The first section is your energy burden measures, which we're going to get to in the next section of the presentation. But that bottom part of the form is the restoration prevention data. And that's parts 2 and 3, right? And as Melissa mentioned, this part really is concerned with a wholly different concept. The concept is where the LIHEAP benefit was applied. And that's a very different piece of information than that first section of the report, which is just a household's main fuel type.
Can you make sure, I'm not sure I'm on the right form.
I'll hold up an example here. So this is on the left side of the packet. It's going to look like this on the front page. And then on the second page, it's going to have LIHEAP performance measures up top, on the top of the page.
It's actually on the back page.
The back page? Sorry. Thank you. So it's going to say LIHEAP performance data form for federal fiscal year 2014, then LIHEAP performance measures right below, Part 5, energy burden targeting, and then 6, restoration of home energy service, 7, prevention of loss of home energy service.
I'm talking about part 2 and 3.
This is kind of there were changes implemented as the form was integrated into OLDC. So Part 6 and 7 refer to Part 2 and 3. Sorry to be a little bit confusing there. So in talking about restoration of home energy service and prevention of loss of home energy service, now that we've reviewed exactly what data you need to collect, let's talk about how that's reported on the form. So focusing on Part 2, we want to emphasize here that the report is for all occurrences of LIHEAP households. And what we mean by that is we know that you're all very well trained on the household report talking about the unduplicated count nowadays. But in this section, we're trying to capture information on the number of times service was restored for households. So that means for electric and gas, we're interested in the count of the number of times that LIHEAP restored service after disconnection. For fuel oil, propane, and other fuel clients, we want you to count the number of times that LIHEAP resulted in delivered fuel after the client ran out. And for all sources, we want you to count the number of inoperable heating systems that were repaired or replaced using LIHEAP. And for electricity, we want you to be sure to include the number of inoperable air conditioners that were repaired or replaced using LIHEAP. And for that all occurrences on the very left side, that sum is going to be auto-calculated, and that is indicated in the form as well. So again, this is concerned with occurrences, not an unduplicated count. We want to talk about where the benefit is actually applied in these cases. And I want to reiterate that this is kind of all connected back to what Melissa was just talking about, right? You're collecting all this data, you're understanding what the home energy service status is of the household. Now you're including this information in this part of the form. So similarly, the next portion is going to talk about the prevention of loss of home energy service. So for electric and gas, we're going to count the number of times that LIHEAP prevented a disconnection. For fuel oil, propane, and other fuels, we're going to count the number of times that LIHEAP delivered fuel to a client who was at risk of running out. And again, those definitions of at risk of, as Melissa mentioned, are up to the state to define. All sources, again, we're counting the number of operable heating systems repaired or replaced with LIHEAP in order to prevent loss of home energy service. And for electric, we want, again, to reiterate that you should be sure to include the number of operable air conditioners repaired or replaced using LIHEAP in order to prevent loss of home energy service. And again, that value for all occurrences is automatically calculated. It's just the sum of the counts in each row. We're not doing an unduplicated count in this section. So does that make sense? It's this part of the form that really, I think, is very different from that top section. And to kind of think about it in a different manner requires you to really understand exactly what data you're getting and exactly how it's needed for this section. And so that's why we kind of really want to emphasize these main points, right? It's all occurrences. It's not unduplicated. It's where the benefit is applied. And we're going to have a lot of chances to kind of review this information over time, but we want to give you the opportunity again for questions for this section. Yes.
Thank you. Definitely need this. I don't speak loud enough. So I just noticed in there it said LIHEAP funds We actually, in Montana, don't do any restoration or turning people back on. There's a totally different program that does this, and it wouldn't be LIHAP funds. Last year we discussed we could count that dollars. I don't think we can the way it's currently written. So I'm just curious on...
Yep. So we understand that there are a lot of different programs out there that are going to deal with these same issues. And I would proffer kind of a similar response as Melissa just offered about weatherization, right? So if you're using DOE dollars to do something, we don't want that reported on the form. If you're using non-LIHEAP dollars to do something, that's not a concern of this form. This is a federal report focused on LIHEAP dollars. Yes.
Excuse me.
You mentioned that you're talking about occurrences, not unduplicated numbers regarding when you prevented someone running out of fuel.
Yes.
But in some states, for example in Connecticut, a delivery is made when the household needs oil in order to prevent being running out, just the way our benefit structure is created. So, I mean, therefore, you'd be getting for each household, for example, 5 occurrences.
So that's possible.
I mean, how would you, do you want all of that tracked for the 40,000 households we provide?
So this is definitely up to the state to decide and really gets into your definition of what you're going to define as nearly out of fuel, right? So
yeah, but I mean, we have a definition for crisis.
Yes.
Which relates to after a household has used up its basic benefits,
Yep.
depending on our matrix. But within that basic benefit, for example, we start fuel deliveries in the middle of November. Those first deliveries for 99% of those households are what we would call restoring imminent risk of running out of fuel because they have not, basically their tanks are almost empty or empty for that first delivery in November. So basically, they're imminent running out of fuel, which is different from what our crisis delivery process is.
I see. Yeah, so and we're concerned with all of those occurrences, right? If there's a crisis situation, we want that information.
Yeah, because
tracked.
these aren't people in crisis as how we define them.
Absolutely. And as Melissa just mentioned, right, this is both crisis and non-crisis payments we're concerned with, right? So if a non-crisis payment, as you're describing, is providing a household with service, and it sounds like they were close to losing it, they were nearly out of fuel.
Well, it's not, yes, because the process is every time you need a fuel delivery, you contact your community action agency and they authorize a fuel delivery. So they're always in imminent.
Well, so, right, it's up to your state's definition of what that imminent risk is. And we would encourage you to work closely with OCS staff, with your liaisons, with Apprise, to ensure that you're creating a definition that's not, giving your state too much credit, right? We don't want to say if you have 50% of your tank, you're at imminent risk of...
No. We tell households to contact us when they're 25%.
Okay. And so in that case,
or a week's worth of fuel.
Yeah, and so in that case, that
Which
lines
is
up with
everyone.
a number of other states and their protocols, right?
Right.
So that house you would be preventing their loss of service. And so we would want you to count that as an occurrence of a prevention of loss for the form. And you're right, you may have 99% of your payments may be preventing loss of service.
Right.
And that's great information. That's what we want to capture. That's how we prove the benefit of the LIHEAP program.
Okay.
Right. Is that? Yes.
I'm back on this at the time of the regular LIHEAP application, not a crisis application. So I come in, let's say I'm applying for LIHEAP, and I'm asked the question about, what's the tank reading on your oil tank? Well, I have 1/8 of a tank, which by Maine standards would be you're in imminent risk.
Yes.
So that's on the date of application. It may take 30 business days to process that application and determine their eligibility for their HEAP benefit, and then it gets dispersed to their vendor of record. So my question is, we're capturing information on the date of application that the benefit ultimately may not be what prevents or restores because they probably had to do something.
In between that time.
Right.
I
So
understand,
I'm
yeah.
trying to understand
No,
how we can.
That's definitely an interesting situation to think about.
That's typical.
Yeah, and I think that, this really gets at questions of, what you really want to ask your clients, right? How are you working with them at time of intake to understand their needs? And I think I would kind of, characterize this as a similar situation to the fact that a lot of clients' households' income changes over the course of, that next month period until their benefit is paid. What the federal government is really concerned with, as kind of outlined in the instructions, is that information that you're collecting at time of application, right? It would be quite burdensome to continually have contact with that client, to really understand how their household is changing over time, and to continually update your information. So the instructions that are currently contained in the forms really focus on that snapshot of time when they first come in and apply. So we want that first snapshot of, this is their income now, this is their current energy service status. And we understand that might change in the interim, but we're interested in capturing that information at the first point. I think that's kind of the best that we can do with the information that we have. We understand that a lot of clients already are, struggling to get basic information when they come to apply to LIHEAP. So we don't think any more information should be required, after that first time they come in and provide you with what they need, right? Absolutely. Yep. Okay. And I think these kind of conversations are great examples of, policy decisions that are going to be a result of conversations that you have both internally with your OCS liaisons and with TNTA contractors like Apprise. And I think, as we kind of would reiterate in this presentation, what's important is that this information is recorded in your state plan, right? You're giving yourself permission to operate the program in this manner. Right? So when you define imminent risk, that information should be in your state plan. When you work to understand the needs of your clients at time of application, that information should be clearly denoted in kind of your program manuals, when you do training with your subgrantees. All that information has to be recorded somewhere as a defined policy so that we can ensure that things are being implemented in a standard manner both across the state, and then we can look at that from a national perspective. Yes?
Excuse me. For the restoration of utility service
Mm-hmm.
and counting a customer, if we give a benefit to the customer, we only count those where our benefit does the restoration. If they have to add additional funds to restore, then we wouldn't count that customer. Am I correct?
When you say additional funds, what?
Like
Yeah.
they might have to, let's say the bill is $600, we
Mm-hmm.
give them $500. And they have another $100 that they have to add in, and they get it restored.
Who's adding the $100?
The customer.
Okay. So we're concerned with just the LIHEAP payment. Right?
Okay.
So this form is really focused on only LIHEAP. So if you restore their service and then they add more on top of that, that's not what the form is concerned with. We're just concerned with what the LIHEAP payment is doing.
Okay.
Yes, in the back.
But flip it, if they make the $100 payment, which is not sufficient, trust me, I don't believe that. It's not sufficient to turn it on, but at the same time, we make the 500, and that's what,
Yep. So that's
the question of which came first, the
chicken or egg. And that's a great example, and I really appreciate that you flipped it, right? So in this case, the client is actually restoring their own service, and LIHEAP would only get credit for what LIHEAP did, which is, to prevent loss. Or in whatever situation you understand the client is in at the current time that you take them at intake. So I understand that in some cases clients are going to help themselves, right? And unfortunately, this form can't capture that information, right?
So you're saying that in both instances, the client restored service?
So in the instance where LIHEAP pays the benefit, right, LIHEAP gets the credit for restoring service. In the instance where the client pays their bill to restore their service, LIHEAP does not get the credit.
So it's a question of timing.
It's a question of timing, yeah.
It's a question of what their home energy status was when they applied.
At the time of application.
So if they come in and they said, we paid the $100 to get our service back on, but we can't keep it on unless we get this additional $500, then we're talking about prevention. This is not perfect data by any stretch of the imagination. And I think the question that came over here is the best example of that. There is going to be changes in a household between the time they apply and between the time you actually administer the payment. And so we're saying that, take a look at the time of application, whatever criteria you're using to make a decision about the benefit you give them, right? So in some states, you may call in between, right? I know there are some states that actually take the time to say, are you still out of energy before they actually administer the payment? They'll make a quick call to the utility. They'll make a quick call to the client. In those cases, if states wish, they could update the status, right? We're saying you should use the time of application, what their home energy status was, and whether they got LIHEAP. If you have more perfect information, use it. In your case, give me an example, because I can see the look on your faces like you're not answering my question.
I think you just made it simpler for me, because if we do it that way, if at the time of application, we know that they're disconnected owing $600, and so we process this and determine, oh, I'm sorry. So then we process it and determine eligibility 3 weeks later, and we know that the benefit's only going to be $500, regardless of what they do. We're going to, because at the time of application they just needed $600 to turn on, we're going to treat it as we didn't do anything, as far as restoration or
then that's how you should measure
prevention.
it. Mm-hmm. You should be measuring it how you're doing it. Don't let these performance measures our number one, maybe not number one goal. I think it's really important, and I'll say this to everyone, performance measures shouldn't drive us, right? Performance measures should measure what we're doing. And that looks different across all of you. So we've given you some standard ways. We've said, based on what we've seen out in the field, the best way to track this information is what was their home energy status at the time of application. Some of you might have better data. You may do a check before they get their benefit. You may make a call to make sure they're still out of service, or you may make a call to see if this is actually going to be preventive or restorative, especially for crisis benefits, right? Some of you have more strict crisis benefit policies. If you have better information and you want to track that, we're not going to stop you. That's fantastic. If you have questions about those examples, when there's a copay situation, because that's kind of what you're hinting at, some of you, is that that person might be out of energy, but you may say you still have to pay $100, and then we'll pay the remaining $500 to restore. In which case, a price would tell you you're still restoring home energy. Without your payment, they're not going to get their home energy back. But in the same situation, if they pay the minimum $100 to get their energy restored, and you give them $500 after they've already been restored, and you have that information, you're now preventing. It's all about the information that you have and common sense. Measure what you're doing. Don't try to make the measure, what you're doing fit the measurement. Just measure what you're doing, and we'll help.
Melissa, I guess I would just add to kind of something that you said, and we don't have to strive for perfection, and don't get too caught in the woods. So just remembering that you're measuring your entire program, and if you have a customer or two with a unique situation, it's okay. And it's important to understand the basics of the performance measures. I think the other thing is being one of the work group members and dealing with this and being involved in several conversations over the last several years is remembering too, and Lauren might reinforce this as well, it's under development. So it's a development measure. So understanding that you're going to design something, you're going to design systems, intake processes that over the first couple of years of reporting your performance measures, you'll check in on yourselves and you may change how you're collecting and or reporting. So I just think that's important to recognize that.
I think we're going to go on to the next. Stay on schedule. Are we on energy? Now we're on the fun stuff that we focus a lot over the last year on performance measures, and people really gravitate towards these because they do take a little more work. They also require work with external stakeholders. And so we're going to talk today, once again, go over for the energy burden measures, what data you need, what the steps are in collecting that data, and what the steps are for reporting this data. So when we talk about data required for energy burden measures, we need 5 things. We need average annual household income, and as we'll talk about in a second, we'll actually go through each of these. I won't do that now. And what we have added onto this slide that's new is we've talked about where you would get that information. So we're assuming that on the application, you would be asking about their income, since you're already supposed to be reporting that, and that's how you calculate eligibility. Average annual LIHEAP benefit. This is something that you would track through data systems, either your subgrantees or your own central database, but someone somewhere should be tracking what money is going out to what households. Main fuel type. This is something that we would anticipate you would collect from the client. And we'll talk about how that's defined in a second. Average annual household main fuel bill and average annual household electricity bill. This is where everybody goes, ah! And this is from vendors, and we're going to talk about all of these. So average annual household income, this is calculated the same way it is for the household report. So you should be using gross income. Zero income households should be included. And if you don't, we've run into a lot of states that say, well, we only collect 3 months or 6 months or 9 months. Well, technically you should be annualizing it for your household report. And the household report instructions give you directions for doing that. And we've actually put a link to those in our performance measures instructions to how to annualize income that isn't 12 months worth. So, I mean, I know there's a lot of, you don't have to start collecting 12 months of data. There's a way to calculate that. This should not be something new. This is not a new data element. If you are completing required reporting right now, you have this data. Average annual LIHEAP bill payment assistance benefit. Once again, this is something that if you have any kind of good financial tracking, you should be able to track the money that's going to households. For those of you who give one payment a year and that's it, you're done, this is really easy, right? You're just going to take that payment. Some of you, however, give a crisis, a regular, a supplemental, equipment repair replacement, and multiple. And this is where that unduplicated piece comes in, right? Because we want to know the total bill payment assistance that they got. So if you gave someone a supplemental payment, a regular payment, and a crisis payment, we want you to add all of those together. Okay. Where's the clicker? Oh. Main fuel type. This is something that not everyone collects. Across states, you see people collecting where the LIHEAP benefit is applied or where people want their LIHEAP benefit applied. But sometimes that's not going to be what their main fuel type is. So, I mean, all of you can probably cite me an example of that, but in some cases, if the furnace is broken, electric or natural gas might be their primary fuel type, but they're currently using wood. And so some of you may define their current primary source as wood. Some of you do that. What we're asking you to do is to ask the customer what their main fuel type is, and it's a self-reported measure. It may not be where you apply the benefit. So to me, this is mind-blowing because this was tricky. We figured this out in Oregon a few years ago, and it was a huge discussion. And I'm always surprised when people don't talk about it, and then they get into their application, they're like, oh, now I see what you mean. This is not an easy thing to tackle. You can specify to your clients what you want to hear from them. So you may wish to put something on your application that says, this is your primary fuel source, regardless of whether it's what you're using or not. You may want to leave it as is and just let them self-report. Either way, from the client, you need to get what their main heating fuel type is. And then whenever we say that, the cooling states jump up and riot, and in some cases really riot. What we want to assure folks is that, remember, we're also collecting electricity, and electricity will capture that cooling element. So people say, why do we need to collect both electric and primary? And we're looking at a whole home burden. And we know for a fact, first of all, that we do have heating and cooling states that do both. We also know that in some heating states, folks are using, once again, their baseboard or space heaters in addition to their natural gas. And in some cases, those costs can be even higher than what they're using for their primary fuel type, and we need to capture that. That's important. Part of the whole point of performance measurement and management is to make sure that money is getting to the people who need it when they need it the most, and we can't tell that information without an idea of their whole picture. So average annual energy bills for main fuel and electricity. Some of you have already gotten started on this. Some of you are looking at it and not ready to jump in yet. Hopefully you have. We are looking at you going to your vendors and actually getting annual cost information from your vendors. And we're not just looking at main fuel or where they got the benefit. And that's sometimes is a little tough to get your head around, right? So a client may have gotten a benefit in natural gas where their primary heating fuel is, but we're also asking you to get their electric data. And some of you are a little trepidatious about going to your electric companies when you're not paying them a benefit and getting data for that. And so we're aware of that. And we'll talk a little about this, that it hasn't been as hard as we thought it would be. I'll be very frank. When I went into the first meeting with PacifiCorp, I was very nervous about this. Why would they give me data for people I didn't make a LIHEAP payment for? And for them, the burden is incremental, right? We're already asking a list for people we did make LIHEAP payments for, and they understand the whole base load and primary fuel. They understand that probably better than we do, and they were very willing to hand over that data. So we do know that that's a challenge, both in asking and in getting, and we're willing to work with folks to do that. So steps you need to take for collecting this data. Adding main fuel type to the client application. So we have put a minimum, there's 5. In order to report on the performance data form, you're going to need to have natural gas, electricity, fuel oil, propane, and other. If you would like, you can add additional. This is Oregon's. They collect pellets, solar. This might be old. But they collect other types as well, and then those would roll into other. They would roll into other. The state of Missouri is below as well, and they say what primary or main form of energy do you use to heat your home? And so by asking heat, you begin to get at a primary fuel type. The second step is to add a waiver or a release of information to the client application. We're going to go in order because there are multiple steps here, right? And they all work together. As those of you who have started implementing this know, it's not linear. This is kind of a lot of stuff at once, but this is definitely the next step. If your clients aren't allowing you to get information from the utility or for you to send information to the utility, it's going to be very hard to get the data you need from the utility. So even before data exchanges are codified or put into vendor agreements, you'll need to make sure that this piece is taken care of. Do you have it so that clients are authorizing you to give data to the utility and the utility to give data back to you? And so we have 2 examples here from Minnesota and Colorado. I think that there's something I want to bring up. I don't want to talk about it a lot, but I do want to bring it up as a consideration. Some of you have dealt with the applicant versus the account holder in authorizations. And this is coming up now more that we're really pushing for data. So I would like to, at least during the question and answer period, hear how other states have dealt with that. Some states have worked it out with their utilities that the account holder can sign the application but doesn't have to be there at the appointment. Do you see what I mean? So, for example, if Nick and I were married, that'd be like Robin the Cradle. So if Nick and I were married and Nick was the account holder but I went in to apply, what would be necessary and what would make it me able to sign that authorization for the folks to still get for you to still get the data at the state. In some cases, it would just require me taking the application home or having it and having Nick sign it. In some cases, signing an affidavit that says I am a representative of this family. In some cases, the utility isn't concerned. We found states where the utility is like, as long as, if we're making a payment on an authorized account, we don't care who's applying. So that's a consideration to consider as consideration. And so give that some thought, and I'd love to hear from all of you about solutions when we get into the Q&A section. The other thing that the waiver language should consider are that information collected on this form may be used for purposes of referral, research, evaluation, analysis. This is Wisconsin's language. And the reason we've pointed this out is that you might not notice, but in your most waivers that exist now, it says necessary to verify payment information. And remember that you're not necessarily making a payment for the data that you're requesting. So it needs to be broader than that. And you can say for any applicant in the state, we're collecting information, and that the information will be used for purposes of research and evaluation. The other piece is making sure that you are basically indemnifying, right? Freeing the utility from any responsibility when your staff member loses the flash drive or accidentally hits send on all of the utility data that they got. How do you make sure that they are released of that liability? And Colorado and New Jersey here both have language here that basically protects the utility once that data is handed over to the state. Let me tell you, you proactively putting this into language and handing it to the utility goes a very long way in terms of utility negotiations. The other option is handing it to the utility and having them put in the language, because they will. Their lawyers will put in this language, and it's a very good show of faith for you to be proactive about saying, we understand this threat, we understand the importance of confidentiality, and we're willing to put this in, to kind of demonstrate that knowledge and understanding.
And I think the thing that we usually emphasize to grantees when talking about these issues of waiver language is it's so important, as Melissa just mentioned, to both involve your utilities and involve your own legal team in the drafting of this language. Oftentimes, you'll have lawyers on hand who can assist you in terms of ensuring that the language is appropriate and ensuring that it is not, overburdensome on your office or your utilities office. And that's an important step to take that we think will enhance your ability to get the data, to work with your utilities in a collaborative process rather than otherwise.
And we just had a call the other day. When you design the waiver language in a vacuum, or the release of information in a vacuum, what will happen is that the utilities who don't feel involved and don't understand what they're looking at may call you and ask you to fax every single release of information that you had signed for clients before they'll release the data. What we heard in a meeting the other day is, we'd be less likely to ask for that or push for that if we had a say in what the waiver language is, and if we knew that waiver language was standardized across all subgrantees. So those of you without subgrantees, this is moot, but many of you do have subgrantees who create their own applications. If they're using standardized release language, you can send that one set of release language to the utility, and they're much more inclined to hand you data. We have heard in states where that's not the case, where every single agency uses their own release language. Utilities have gotten kind of persnickety and said, we want you to fax us copies of releases for every client you're requesting data on. For some of you, just the idea of that should cause a nightmare. So this is really an important piece. Get them involved, have them help. It will save you time in the long run. Adding vendor account numbers to the client application for both main fuel and electricity. Remember that you are going to be, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, but you're going to be sending the utilities account numbers, names, and addresses for which you want cost information back. You're not calling the utility up and saying, for everyone that got LIHEAP, we want this data. No, you are initiating a data exchange by sending them data. You need to have that data. For some of you, this is moot. You absolutely already collect the account number. Some of you have subgrantees, though, that don't already report this to you. This is something that needs to be on there. And it also needs to be on there for electric. Many of you get the account number for the place you're making the payment. We need it for both the place you're making the payment and electric, or electric and main fuel. It doesn't matter whether you're making a payment there or not. So we've put the state of Ohio's application in here as an example. We may have put another one. Nope, just Ohio's. We have other examples of applications, and actually on the clearinghouse, NCAT clearinghouse, there are other examples if you want to go ahead and take a look at that. It may not need to be as ornate as this, but the idea is you should be counting or getting account information for both the main fuel and electric, regardless of whether you're making a payment there or not. We're going to talk a little bit more about this in the next section, the identification of the top 5, top 10 vendors. Remember that to decrease burden for you and utilities or vendors, we've kind of said that prioritizing the top 5 and top 10 vendors in your state in different categories will reduce your burden and still get you a really good amount of information. So Nick is going to talk a little bit about how to prioritize that, but it is important to identify who are our big ones. Some of you know right off, right, who the big utilities are, but some of you may have a bunch of big ones and you need to figure out and hone in on which ones you should target first to get data. And then vendor agreements. This is all of you, I can say now, either have vendor agreements or are working on vendor agreements. And so for some of you, implementing performance measurement and collecting data from the utility, especially data that may not relate to a payment, means reopening up your vendor agreements and putting data exchange language in there. We're recommending that just like the client waiver, you do this in partnership with your utility, and that if you have a lot of subgrantees who do the vendor agreements, for example, there are several states where the subgrantee holds the agreement with the utility, it's best to have a standardized agreement across your state. So the state and the utility and a subgrantee, I'll give the example of Arizona right now, who has their state, the subgrantees, and the utilities all working together to create that boilerplate language that will be used in their state for their vendor agreement. Here's examples of language in Texas and in Wisconsin. This is actual how to get cost and usage data. And then this is, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but I'll just hit on it right now. There are many ways to get this data. We already talked about this once. Some of you have centralized databases, some of you don't. Some of you use this information already at the time of intake and get this information at the time of intake. Some of you don't collect this information at all. And so while there are ways to do this in an automated fashion, those of you who are starting from scratch, to try and jump from A to Z is not always the best method. You can use Excel and Access. There's only so many rows in Excel, it turns out. You can use Excel or Access to get a lot of this information. So don't think that just because you don't have a super sophisticated system that you are unable to collect this data. That is absolutely not true, and you can no longer use that as an excuse. It's just not the case. And so we will help you come up with whatever you're already collecting. We can help you build on to that. We can help you start from scratch. We've helped states in both situations to do that. So keep in mind that this year-end system, which is what a lot of folks are going to do, requires literally an exchange of Excel or Access spreadsheets. We do want to make sure you're doing secure transfers, so we can help you with that. Most of the time, the utility will actually bring that up. But it's the process itself does not need to be complicated or sophisticated.
So as Melissa just mentioned, a lot of this data exchange with your office and the utilities and delivered fuel vendors can be done in a pretty simplistic fashion. And From our conversations with grantees, we know that there are a lot of ways of doing this. We know that some states in the previous slide, like we mentioned, have automated systems. We know that some actually physically call up the vendor during the time of client application to get information about that client's energy use and cost. In this example, we're talking about sending Excel files back and forth between your state office and the vendor, the energy vendor. So I want to stress that these are example templates. These are by no means required templates. They're examples of how you can go about this data transfer process. And these examples are also included in the packets that you received. And we've broken them out by fuel type. So you have a template for working with your gas and electric vendors. You have a template for working with your LPG propane vendors. And you have a template for working with your fuel oil and kerosene vendors. And it's important to consider that these are templates. Again, you can take these as you will and work closely with your particular energy vendors to see what would work best for them to get you the data that you need for the form. So the first example of how you can request the data is very simplistic, right? Starting on the left side, you have your account number, the account last name, the account first name, the service address, city, state, and zip. That's all the information that you really need to send to the vendor about the clients that you assisted during the fiscal year to get energy cost and usage information from them. So how can the data be sent back to you? So we have examples by fuel type. And again, you're starting with the account number on the left, the account name, service address, city, state, zip, all standard stuff. In this case, you are lucky enough to get annual usage and cost. You may only be able to get cost. You may not even be able to get annualized data. You might have to sum up 12 lines by month. But this is just an example of what you might receive back from a utility. In this case, in this best case scenario, we're also indicating that you can get information of whether the client spent a full year at their service address. We realize that not every energy vendor is going to have that information, but we've heard from other grantees out there that that information is very useful and also helps them with working with the data in the state office. Again, this is an example template of what you might get. The electric vendor is in the bottom, and you're getting annual usage and the cost, best case scenario. An example for LPG propane. Again, we're starting with the LPG propane account number on the left, account name, service address, city, state, zip. You're getting, luckily enough, the annual propane usage here in gallons, the annual propane cost in dollars. You're getting information of whether they're at their service address for the full year. And you're also asking the utility, the delivered fuel vendor in this case, is this a 12-month client? So does the vendor know whether this client only purchased fuel from your company? Again, that might not be information that every delivered fuel vendor has, but it's great when you can get that information. It helps you really understand what data you're getting about each client. And we have heard, I think Susan Marshall mentioned that she's even including information on the application requesting whether clients purchased fuel from multiple vendors. Again, there's lots of different ways to get information about the purchasing habits of clients so you understand what kind of data you have for each client. And the last example is fuel oil and kerosene. The exact same as the propane example. So are there any questions about those sample templates for you to start data exchange processes with? Ooh, no questions. All righty. And again, lots more opportunities for questions, and there'll also be a break coming up soon. So to continue on, so we've talked a lot about home energy burden and how you get that data. Now the purpose of this section is to really show you how you use that energy burden data that you've collected in order to prepare the portion of the LAHI Performance Measures Report section of the performance data form. So again, I would encourage you to refer back to that form that's included in your packet that we were looking at earlier. And now we're focusing on that top half, that energy burden targeting section of the form. So what households should be included in this first portion of the performance measures report? So we want to stress that Part 1 includes those households who receive LAHI bill payment assistance during the reporting period. And we define bill payment assistance as including heating and cooling assistance and crisis assistance, as we've talked about earlier in the presentation. And we would really want to emphasize that households should not be counted if they did not receive a bill payment, a cash benefit, that directly impacted their home energy bill. So we know, for example, some states operate, energy education programs. We know states operate a plethora of programs that really target a lot of different areas of households' needs. But we only want to focus on bill payments in this section of the form. And that includes households receiving only LIHEAP weatherization assistance or energy-related home energy repair. We don't want those included in this first part of the form. Households that receive nominal benefits as part of the partnership with SNAP, we don't want those included in this part of the form. And that's, as you may know, often referred to as the Heat or Eat program. So this is the graphic that's pulled straight from the instructions that you also have included in your packet. So it's broken into sections A through E, also known as lines A through E. And only 3 of those sections actually require you to enter data, and the remaining sections are auto-calculated for you. So which clients are included? Grantees should start with a data set for Part 1 and use a piece of that data set to report in each section. All right, so that first section is all bill payment assisted households. The next section is a smaller subset, which is the bill payment assisted households for which you have available energy cost data for 12 months. And the last part of that is the highest burden households. So the bill payment assisted households with available energy costs for which you have 12 months that are the top 25% in terms of their energy burden out of your data set. All right, so now we're walking down the form step by step. All right, so that first step, Part 1, energy burden targeting, you're reporting on the unduplicated number of LIHEAP bill payment assisted households by fuel type. And this information in the future is going to be pulled from your household report form. So there's going to be this field replicated in the household report form and connected to the performance data form. So we're looking to kind of ensure that we're not asking you for information twice, right? These are just the general count of unduplicated households that you assisted with bill payment assistance. Not weatherization, not SNAP, just bill payment assistance. Right? So now continuing to walk down the form, that next part includes only those households that you know got bill payment assistance that you can collect 12 consecutive months of data for. And by 12 consecutive months, we're talking about their main fuel and their electric information. So you might not have information for all of your clients. In fact, we would assume that you would not have information for all of your clients. But we want you to only focus here on those that you do have information for. So you are reporting, right, that unduplicated number of households with 12 consecutive months of bill data, and you're reporting their average annual household income in that second line, and in that third line, you're reporting their average annual total LIHEAP benefit per household. And when we say LIHEAP benefit, again, we want to reiterate, we are including the heating assistance payment, the cooling assistance payment, the crisis assistance payments, and the supplemental benefits, right? So we're continuing to walk down the form. And we're also asking grantees to report households' average main heating fuel bill, as we've discussed, and their average annual electricity bill. And the remainder of the lines in this section are auto-calculated, so you don't have to worry about them at all. So it's really only those first lines, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, where you're entering information. And it's going to look exactly like this in OLDC, as some of you might have seen already. Now, the next section, as I mentioned, is focusing on the households with the highest burden. And we define that highest burden as the top 25%. So you will need to use income information that you have and the energy cost information that you've collected to calculate the burden for your households in your data set. And that is a step that we've heard from grantees comes with some concerns. That's absolutely something that Apprise staff can assist you with. It's something that if you talk to your IT department, they should be able to help you with. It's a calculation that's quite simple in nature, and once you get down to it and specify what you need, your IT people should be able to provide you that information. If you don't have an IT department, Apprise staff can help you run those data queries on your Excel spreadsheets. It's not something that should be too challenging for most grantees to produce. So considering that you have now this segmented population that you know is in the top 25% with the highest energy burden, you're then going to provide the exact same information that you just did for all your households, right? So you're going to first provide their income. You're going to provide their total life benefit, again, heating, cooling, crisis, and supplemental. Then you're going to provide the average annual main fuel bill and the average annual electric bill. So that's exactly on the form where it's coming from. And the rest of the form, again, is auto-calculated. So you don't have to worry about those last couple lines. Any questions about this part of the form? So we covered this in the national training last year, and we want to cover it again. And I think now that some states have already started to collect this data, we're in a little bit better of a position to really focus on the nitty-gritty. So, yes.
I just want to check in about something. On several of the slides, it talks about main fuel only and electric.
Yes.
A lot of households in my state have secondary and actually third heating systems. Yep. And so I want to be clear that we're not collecting, because we talk about getting whole house energy usage in some slides, and then we talk about main fuel and electric only. So we're not collecting the consumption on secondary or tertiary heating systems?
That's a great question. And we know a lot of clients are using, maybe a wood burning stove, as Melissa mentioned, to supplement their household's energy use. In those cases, we only want to focus, as you mentioned, on their main fuel and their electric. It definitely makes sense to understand information about that tertiary fuel group, especially in a state like Maine. But since these measures are for everyone, we really want to just focus on those top two parts, given that that's what most clients are going to be using, right? And so you may want to collect actually more information than what's required in the performance data form. And that's something that really will provide you with great information about, as you mentioned, the household's total energy use. But that's not something that we're requiring of you for the form.
I have a question.
I just have
in the back.
Yep.
It's a great question. I think it's a great question because, oftentimes at the state level, people struggle with making payments for main fuel and also secondary, tertiary fuel source. And I have seen in occasions where LIHEAP dollar can be split, payments can be split between primary and secondary or even tertiary heat, 50-50 situation, maybe 75-25. So I just wanted to clarify that we are not asking grantees to collect statistics on those situations.
We're not, no.
We're not. Okay, good.
So let me clarify. You're capturing cost information about their main heat and their electricity. When you capture the payment amount, however, you're capturing their entire payment, regardless of whether it was made to that primary or electric. So we're still capturing the dollars, all the dollars going to households, so we wouldn't ask someone who gives a payment to electric, natural gas, and wood to separate out the payment information. But we are asking you to separate out their primary fuel and electric, whether or not what their primary fuel was. So,
It's me. Can you reiterate what to do if the primary fuel type and is electric? What is it that we do?
That's a great question. Yep. So I think it'd be actually probably best if you look at this on your own forms. It's a little bit hard to see. But so in the case where their main fuel is electric, you can see here, if a client's main fuel is electric, you're not going to report their annual electricity bill because you're already doing that in the line above, right? So that's grayed out, and that's why that's grayed out. So that's a perfect thing to focus on. If the household's main fuel is electric, you're not going to report it twice. We just want you to put it in that first box right there.
If you're looking to collect the data on electric for the top 5 electric companies,
yep.
Are you really looking at a percentage of the state that's covered? Because like in Vermont, 70% is covered by one company,
yep.
And then the bulk of the remainder are little mom and pop operations.
Yep. And that's, so we're going to definitely get into that issue in in later slides. And this really touches on your prioritization of effort. We understand that that situation applies in a lot of states. It actually even applies here in Maryland, in D.C. actually as well. D.C. has very few electric vendors that cover a large percentage of the clients. So in those cases, we really want you to focus on the top 5, right? Because those are the requirements. But we would give you recommendations on prioritization of your effort. And so we're going to save that conversation for a little bit later. So I want to hold off on that for now. But it definitely is a very important point because getting data from munis and co-ops is going to be more difficult, right? It's just something that we've heard. But the requirements are the requirements, and Apprise has recommendations for you on how to best work to meet those requirements. And so that's something that we want to be cautious of, just in the sense that we want to get the best data possible, but we don't want to overburden your office in trying to collect data from places that are difficult to collect data from. And that's definitely a good conversation to have, and we will, I promise, have that later on. Yes? Okay. Oh, go ahead.
On the unduplicated number of LIHEAP households, you said that we need to tie that back to the household report, right? But
it's going to be automatically done for you. Yeah, it's going to be pulled automatically.
Okay, but that includes weatherization, the any type, right? If we're doing unduplicated by any type, that includes weatherization. Mm-hmm. But I thought we didn't want to.
That's a great question. Yeah. So actually, on the household report form now, as you mentioned, there's an unduplicated count that includes weatherization, right? On a future form, there's going to be another line that has unduplicated bill payment assistance. And that's just your bill payment assistance by main fuel type. And so that's the information that's going to be pulled in. So you're correct. It would not pull in that total unduplicated count that includes weatherization. It would actually be pulling in a different unduplicated count that's just bill payment assistance.
Okay. And so we know that's on the federal fiscal year. Mm-hmm. But I think in some of the instruction they said that you can also pull information by a different period, right?
For your energy costs,
okay,
that's information that you can choose the reporting period to pull in on. We understand that a lot of states do this on different timeframes. So some people do automated exchanges that do it so frequently, it would be silly to impose, a different restriction on them that is a different reporting period, right? So you're correct in that is one piece of the form that you can pull in information for that is not the federal fiscal year. So that energy cost data is something that you would work with your state to determine the best reporting period and work with your utilities to determine at what time you want to conduct the data transfer to get the best information about your clients.
So some of the people in the total household won't be the data we get back, right? That's what you're saying.
Sorry, say that again. So
if I'm basing this total household on the federal reporting period, there will be people in the other parts of the report that may not be in that total LIHEAP number, right, at the top.
So in that total LIHEAP number, it's just your unduplicated bill payment assistance households. But you're correct. Some of those households you won't be able to get information for, right? So it's going to be what we would assume is a lesser number for households that you actually are able to collect that full set of energy cost data.
And the overlap. What she's getting at is the timing, right?
Yeah.
Right. So you're saying that if you go back 12 months from January, let's say you're collecting January through December from the utilities, there will be some clients in that data set that don't match up with the clients in your household report data set. And we are aware of that. It's kind of a little apple-orangey. So, yeah. Does that make sense? Okay. I think in the back.
Yeah, I have another question. This came from our Georgia Power Company. She said payments are applied to past accounts overdue first, and then the remainder is posted to the new account. She just wants us to clarify, what do we collect? Do we collect the past due, or do we wait and whatever was applied to the rest? Is that what you want her to collect on? She said they do that in every case if there's a past due amount or if the account is closed. Now, I know if the account is closed, it's different, but for past due, they apply to the past due amount first, and then they apply it, the remainder.
So to be clear, if Nick came in to our office and said, I need an account open, I need to have energy assistance, what you're saying is that the utility might take some of your energy assistance to close out or pay for and to close out an old account before applying it to a new account?
Yes.
So it'd be two different account numbers?
Yes.
So congratulations, that's a first. My inclination immediately is that we're looking at 12 months of data for every person. And what we're telling every state is that if the utility has the wherewithal to be able to track between account numbers, that if they can give you 12 months of data, that's great. If that's going to be a huge burden on the utility and really they can only give you 3 months plus 9 months, right? Because they've switched account numbers and they don't track people, they track account numbers. Then that would not be something you'd be required to report.
I would kind of echo in this situation what Jane mentioned earlier, is that there are a lot of these very nitty-gritty policy decisions that are going to come up as you work on these issues. And we talked about it with where clients make payments towards their own bills as part of this. We talked about it, where you're working with utilities to really get the best data possible, within each client's particular situation. But our estimation is that these kinds of questions happen rather infrequently. And on the larger perspective, we want you to focus on, getting the best data possible. And as Jane mentioned, these are developmental measures. We realize you're not going to get a perfect data set and that you're going to have to work through some of these issues. And we want to emphasize that we are available to support you when you work through those issues and that we're available for conversation. Your OCS liaison is also available for conversation when you need to think about how to best get information for the performance data forum. So these are really interesting questions, and I think we want to always bring it back to the fact that these are particular details that you're definitely going to come across as you work on it, but the larger perspective is just getting the best data possible in accordance with the federal reporting instructions that are included in your packets. I think now we're going to take a short break.